right, so yeah, I must have pressed something. I think that other one is open someplace. So we talked about this one already, I think. This was last week. We discussed how this idea that how we learn causality through projecting of objects and behaviors and so on. I was still working on, I'm still interested in understanding how the whole cortex works. And I feel like before I really dive into the behaviors and how we're doing goal-oriented behaviors, I felt like I needed more bigger context. And specifically, I think about behaviors like, we've talked about making a pot of coffee or something. There's all this temporary memory involved, like where did I put this and where is that? And I just saw this over here. And so this is what I've been working on. I just feel like I want to have a much better understanding of how temporary memory, hippocampus, episodic memory works with the cortex. I drew this diagram here. This is something we've talked about before, but I don't think we've ever had a diagram of it. This is an idea that didn't come, it wasn't our idea. I read it in a paper or two. I don't think it's widely held, but it seemed to make a lot of sense to me. This is looking at a slice of the cortex here. Let me just bring up this here is a slice of the cortex. And if it folds around the outside of your temporal lobes and underneath, so behind your ear, and it folds up into the center of the brain. So this is all laid out flat, but it's curving into the center, more center of the brain. The end of the cortex, it becomes wonky. It doesn't look like standard cortex anymore. And there's several regions. There's the parahippocampal and stuff, but often people just talk about the entorhinal cortex is the next one. So if you looked at like the Feldman-Van Essen diagram, they show cortex, and they show projecting the entorhinal cortex, but it's literally at the edge of the sheet. And then we talk about them talking about it being a 3-layer entorhinal cortex. It folds around on itself, and this upper part here is the hippocampus proper. And so these two things are folded around. There's something in between, a little tissue they call the subiculum, I think. Anyway, so grid cells are here, place cells are up here. There's connections that go across like this. And so it was speculated that maybe this was like working like a cortical column, and that maybe someone even said that maybe this started first and then it evolved into this. We don't really need that to be the case. We don't really care which one evolved first, but the idea that there's analogs between the 6-layer cortex and what's going on in the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex is pretty cool. And even the fact that there's head direction cells in there, it doesn't mean this order is the same as preserved here, but all these things are in here. This is equivalent to our orientation cells. So that was the idea there, that these things, and so lately we've been talking about like, okay, if you took a slice through these things here, that would be equivalent to a cortical column, or at least somewhat equivalent. And so there could be some cortical columns here, so we can understand, how the cortex works by what we've learned about place cells and grid cells. That's been a theme of our work for a long time. I just drew it out like this on this lower picture here, and I'm not showing all the regions, of course, but it's one of the things is, so I'm showing columns within a region. This is subregion 1, like it could be V1 or S1. There's columns in the next region, V2 or S2, and then so on, going up some sort of our hierarchical connections. And what's noticeable in the brain is that the first 2 regions are very large. V1, V2 are very, very large. S1, S2 are very large. They get that in terms of the number of columns, and they get smaller pretty quickly after that, which is kind of odd because you might think, if you didn't know anything that we know, you might think like, well, it seems like you have a lot more knowledge about the large things in the world than you have about the small things in the world. So, whatever. The scale changes too. So each column here was looking at a small part of the small part of the skin. These columns seem to be looking at larger parts. And then certainly when you go up, higher up, the columns, the cells in those columns seem to represent entire visual regions, or maybe the entire space of the, multimodal, so on. So we're getting rid of going away from very specific small to very large. And interesting, you see the same progression in the grid cells in the entorhinal cortex. There's a series of them, the small, medium, and large going up basically progressing in the area which they represent. And when I first heard about this, I thought, oh, that's very analogous to what's going on down here. And so for whatever reasons, one of the reasons, if we need to represent different scales, they're representing different scales up here as well. There's a question about how many column equivalents are there in the hippocampal complex. And I don't know the answer to that question. Every time I've read about it, they talk about, oh, there's one grid cell module at one scale, and another grid cell module at another scale, and another grid cell module at another scale. And indeed, if you remember the tank paper, and I can bring it up if you want me to bring up the picture again, they show this one sort of grid cell module. It's about the size of a cortical column in a rat. And they say the next one over is a different scale. And so but it's hard to believe that, these things are pretty small. They're less than a millimeter. So, if you have a bunch of them in a row, that would imply it's like a skinny little strip of these things. And I just don't know the answer to that question. People write about it. There's one grid cell module per scale. But anyway, so I accepted that. I went with that idea, but I'm not certain it's true. I've also read different things. I've read sometimes people say, oh, there's only like 4 or 5 different scales. And then one time I read there's something like 10 or 12. So I'm not sure, but that could also be species. Like it could be, in primates, there might be a lot more different scales or more of these things. And rodents would be simple, just like the cortex. We have about 10 or 12 so hierarchical levels in our cortex. And I think I once read that primates have a similar equivalent. And the other big difference here is, of course, that these neurons can learn very rapidly, right? So we have theories about that, maybe using the silent synapses. But this is where all your episodic memory is formed. And this is where you can learn temporary arrangements of things. So again, I walk in a room, I say, oh, where's the bananas are in the middle of my counter? Where's this? Where's that? Where's Neil's? Blah, blah, blah. That's all you're going to you're having a short-term memory for that. As far as you know, all that occurs up here. So that's the two things that differentiate this is that the main thing is it's got a very quick memory up here. So I put in gray here.
Maybe it's worth commenting on that. Just that I think a lot of theories are that working memory is in prefrontal cortex, which is, I guess, just interesting to think about how that might work.
Yeah, I know. And so, I didn't mention that because, anyway, I haven't found that. I don't know if convincing evidence is not happening in the hippocampus either. But I did remember
not either or, yeah.
Prefrontal cortex, what it does, any kind of working memory that's not like, oh, remember these 7 digits, right? That's different. But working memory as in, oh, I just walked in, I walked down the street and I saw this and I saw that and I saw this and I saw that. That could also be happening. Remember I mentioned there's some of the regions right before the entorhinal cortex are different too. They're a little wonkier. So you could have some fast memory in here as well. I think that'd be fine. But I guess maybe.
But yeah, I like that point that, at least when working memory is classically studied, it is more in a kind of non-spatial sense. It's more just like, maybe a sequence, and then otherwise just like retaining a set.
Okay, well, that's interesting because I did read a paper once that there are special neurons dedicated to that. Dedicated to learning like digits, remember this set of digits, or remember this set of words. And I think those might have been prefrontal cortex.
I think it can also be for objects, but it's, I don't know. I'm just, in my mind, it's not typically with an arrangement.
Right, a list is different than, a list is different than what I'm talking about here. But that's a good point, Niels. I didn't really, I'm oversimplifying a lot of stuff here. But some of these principles would be the same. You could argue that, like when I learn a list of words, I forget it really quickly. It's just like it's gone. But if I walk into my kitchen and I see the arrangement of certain things, and I go away and I come back, 10, 20 minutes later, I'm going to remember that arrangement. It seems to be a different type of memory. So I've been only thinking about that kind of memory where you're basically learning a spatially based models but you're learning them very rapidly, but you don't remember them more than, they're gone in anywhere from, 10 minutes to, 10
Right.
days or something like that. So
Yeah, the working memory, if anything, just feels simpler. It's just some sort of network that can basically clamp a series of
right,
representations and say like, hold on to these for a bit.
right,
They're
right,
probably important.
right. And I think
And,
there are papers that suggest there's a special set of cells for those.
okay.
They don't appear about that. So right, it's a good point. I'm not talking about that. I'm basically thinking about the kind of models we've been talking about, these spatial models, and that we know that we're able to learn those very rapidly in the hippocampus. The kind of models like the cortex can learn. So I'll stick to that for now. I think I was about to talk about these gray arrows here between the columns. Well, these quote columns, the hippocampal column equivalents. And I don't know of evidence about one way or the other about whether there are hierarchical connections between these two. Like, does it follow like what we see here? It's not, I don't know. So I just put them in gray. I'm just not aware of that one way or the other. So this was some empirical data. I felt mostly empirical data. Koji, you wrote over on the side here.
Yeah, just
Well, again, why did I have separate head directions? This is just empirical data. So this is supposedly, they've given a name to this thing called the subiculum. So what the hell? Obviously, if you go look at real neural tissue, this stuff is all glued together and bloody and messy, right? So it's not like, it's nothing really clean like this, right? Did you have a different understanding of what that looks like, Hojang?
no. I was just wondering, like, if the 3 layers of the hippocampus and the 3 layers of the entorhinal cortex merging. I was wondering if, like, why you kind of separated out head direction cells. That was it.
Well, because sometimes people don't even mention this little interstitial area here, and it's this thing called the subiculum. Sometimes they don't even bring it up, and they just say, "Oh, there's head direction cells in this," and then some people call it out as separate. I don't know. So,
yeah,
it's not exactly the same. Obviously, the hippocampal complex is going to do things differently, and it's going to have some other features, but the idea that it's working on sort of building models that are reference frame based, that's where the whole idea came from here, and we extrapolated to the cortex, right? So this is where our research, once we deduced we had to have reference frames in the cortex, we said, oh, let's look over here and see what this looks like. And I don't know if it has anything to do with the striate cortex at all. Probably not. I would imagine not. Those are good questions, though. All right, so now I started thinking about this, and then I'm still confused about it. So maybe today we can relieve my confusion. But one of the things that always confused me about the thousand brains theory is, on the one hand, we have to model things as simple as like circles and ovals, and on the other hand, we're modeling things like cars and societies and buildings, and the same columns are doing both. And at times I think I understand, and sometimes I get a little confused. but what's certainly true is that at one end, something like V1, there are no child objects to V1. No one's projecting to it, so it's just stuff coming from the sensor. So V1 can't be building compositional models unless the compositional components, the child components, are like an edge. Where I get confused is the difference between an orientation, like we have orientation columns, and the feature. In V1, it seems like the orientation and the feature are one and the same. Like, oh, it's an edge and then it's at this angle. Okay, well that's an edge. it's an angle. What's clear when we start going up the hierarchy, we now can start having child objects to the parent objects, and so now we can say,
I thought even at the lowest level, the feature could be things that don't have orientations, like color or temperature or texture. Or
we've said that.
Like, it's not a compositional object, but it's
right.
like a proto object, like just a very basic
Maybe.
feature without an orientation.
Right, I know. I never felt quite comfortable with that because it doesn't, what's a feature? If I describe, if I want to think of a feature as something at some orientation, then I can't get that with a color. An alternate way to do that is you might say, oh, there are cells in the retina that are center surround cells that respond to color, meaning like color boundaries. Then you could say, oh, well, the feature is a color boundary at some orientation.
Oh, the way I was
Isn't it
thinking
kind
of
of
the
like,
feature is that it is rotation invariant. It's totally independent of the orientation. Like the child object ID is independent of its orientation. In the same way, the color is always the same no matter how it's oriented.
Right, but if the child object is a logo, it does have an orientation relative to the cup.
Yeah, but the orientation would then be the morphology part of it. Like the orientation
Yeah.
would be the mini column, and the object ID would be the
So
specific activations.
so I guess in your language, I think I need better language here for me. I still find this confusing. So you're saying the orientation is the morphology feature.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure if you saw, I wrote on the Slack post that I think there's always an orientation at the lowest and at the highest level. And at the higher levels, it's the orientation of the child relative to the parent. And then the child object ID would be the specific activations within that orientation column. And then,
well, what if I didn't have color? I was colorblind. Would there be anything
you
other
don't
than
need to, no, because the driving input is the pose, is the morphological feature. And then you can just associate non-morphological features as well.
right? Right.
Um,
Okay, maybe it's all clear.
maybe, I don't know if it helps, but I feel like at the lowest level, it's almost like anything that's like maybe anything that's processed by center surround kind of results in a morphological feature.
Right,
Because that's essentially what it does. And anything outside of that is going to be a non-morphological feature because it's
Right.
just going to be information, like it's just gonna be a bit pattern, but
Right.
it doesn't change as a function of kind of
Right.
rotation or whatever.
So in my mind, I'm trying to ignore the color issue right now, but I think that's a good way to phrase it. If I understood it, it's probably like, okay, I got a bunch of center surround bits. If I run them through spatial pooler, I would likely get some edges at different orientations, but I might also get some other things. I might get a little texture or something like that. And I think what you said, anything that I can take from center surround bits and run it through a spatial pooler, that's my
Yeah, like, and you might even have, if some neurons are sensitive to particular colors, then some of neurons are going to be on and some aren't. And that's not giving you an edge, but that's just telling you, oh, okay. I mean, that's telling the column, oh, some neurons are on here.
Yeah.
What that is in practice is a color that's at a particular location, and that just becomes kind of slightly predictive.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just helpful, although it's not really on the topic that I wanted to get to today. So I think
I think the main point you made still applies in the same way. It would just be that it's not as black and white as the pictures up there where there's no child objects at the bottom and no morphology at the top. It exists in both places, but the lower levels would rely more on morphology, whereas the higher levels can rely a lot more on the child object.
If we equate morphology with orientation, then that's right. I guess I was still confusing, thinking like, oh, morphology is like an actual edge, but it's not. It's if you just say it's the orientation, then yes, then there's orientation everywhere.
Yeah, that's how I was at least thinking of it, just because of kind of generalizing the idea of like mini columns represent the orientations, even if it's like orientation of child relative to parent and not actually the orientation of an edge.
Right. Well, I think
there's still an open question about like how do we make the orientation of different objects meaningful, like mutually meaningful, but it feels solvable. And then I think that would be nice. So what I mean by that is like, we talk about the fruit face example.
Yeah.
that works because a particular pose of the banana kind of maps onto a pose of lips in some
Yeah.
meaningful way.
Yeah.
But it feels like there's at least a handful of solutions to that. So
Right.
I don't know. So
So
I guess I'm just saying, like, I think there's still details to work out, but I also think that makes sense.
So, but I think the point I'm going to make here is sort of an orthogonal point. What struck me is anywhere in this hierarchy, you know, a column's trying to learn and infer, and if almost anywhere except for the primary region, there'll be a child object. We can argue there's no child object to be one, but you know, unless you know, put away color for the moment. But as soon as you get one level up, you'll start having parent-child relationships, and those parent-child objects are going to get more sophisticated. And the real point of all this is down here in the beginning, since there really are no any kind of sophisticated child objects or none whatsoever, the only way you can infer an object quickly is you have to have lots of columns looking at all the different locations and voting. I mean, if you didn't have that, a single column would be able to do it, but it would take a long time. It'd have to move around and sense lots of spaces, lots of places. But so if we don't want to take that time, then we have to have lots of columns voting, each one looking at different points and doing their sort of joint assessment. And you can say, oh, okay, that's, you know, a cat, or whatever, an oval, whatever it is. But when you start getting sophisticated child objects, you don't need to do that anymore. That is, if a child object to some, so for example, if I was, if the Memento logo only appeared one place in the world on a mug, then as soon as I see the child object, I would know it's part of the mug. Or how about, I was using the intersections a lot in my examples here. So I would say like, hey, I'm trying to recognize an intersection. If there's two sort of very largely unique objects in that intersection, all I have to do is attend to those 2 points, those 2 spots, and I'll uniquely identify the whole system. I don't have to observe lots of different points around the intersection or around the room or something like that. And so I think I might have described this better than I'm doing it right now. But as you go in this direction, as the child objects become more sophisticated, you don't really need to do voting. You can, you know, if I walk into some place, I want to recognize where I am, and I'm trying to, unless I have a model of that in my hippocampal memory, I just need to see, you know, 1 or 2 sort of semi-unique objects, and then the relative position, and I'm done. I don't have to sense all the edges of a room or all the parts of an environment or all, you know, anything. As long as I've just got some very high saliency, one totally unique child object, or maybe 2 or 3 fairly unique child objects, and seeing the arrangement, and then I'd recognize where I am. And that seems what I do when I walk around the world. I don't do flash inference at an intersection. I basically I'll do a few saccades, and within a second, I know exactly where I am. And so there was this just from this large voting to a point where you don't rely on voting much. And it could explain that you really could get away with 1 column up here, 1 column per scale, I should say. Because I don't need to vote. It's you know, we're just saying this column, as long as I can observe enough really unique child objects, and it's not that hard to do because child objects at this point are very sophisticated. They're large objects. They're not simple things. Then that's sufficient for inferring where I am. And so it could be that we really do have 1 column at these different scales that learn everything we need to learn. It's not really burdening this column any more than burdening one of these columns. We assume down here that these columns all have to learn the same models. They all have to learn models of everything. So every one of these columns have to learn a model of everything. We're just saying, okay, I only need 1 now. I don't need a bunch of columns all doing the same thing. I just need 1. And because of that, I think that was the primary thing I got out of this picture. Jose wrote something. Oh, you like this idea? That's good. Thank you.
Yeah,
I think
the internet
one
says the more you
one
need the
just
child to
random
understand.
thought
Yeah.
that maybe fits with this as well is I mean there could be different reasons for this, but I seem to remember not only are there lots of V1 is huge, as you say, lots of columns. I seem to remember the columns themselves are bigger.
I think that is
Than
true.
in
Well, I'm not sure.
in
I think
typical cortex.
yeah, I think
I
maybe.
can try and look it up, but I seem to remember that's the
Well,
case.
I think part of the problem there is what's the definition of a column? I mean, that's where I got my millimeter square column because they talked about the hypercolumns in V1, and they're about a millimeter square, millimeter on a side. And then people, oh no, that's too big. I mean, we're defining a column as the extent of one grid cell module. But the other ways that they define columns, it could be confusing.
Yeah,
So,
no, that's a fair point.
because no one's thinking there's a grid cell module there. So they're figuring out columns mostly by some sort of response properties of the cells. And they're, it's just, we could go into it, but I think there's lacking consistency in how people define or measure a column size. But it could be they're larger too. I could go for that. I mean, why not? But it was like this sort of hit me over the head like a hammer. Like, oh my God, all this stuff down here is really just to speed things up. We've said this in the past. I know it's not like a new idea. I'm actually not introducing any new ideas here. It's just clarity of understanding. I mean, no, there's no new mechanisms involved here. I'm just trying to get some clarity of understanding. And I think it's also interesting that you still have these scales up here. So that's pretty fundamental. I mean, I think, it fits with our idea that you need scales because objects come in different sizes and a single column can't adjust enough. Now, that also lines up with parent-child relationships because parents tend to be larger objects than child. In fact, they almost always are. The child that's consumed or is generally not bigger than the parent, right? It can't. So I don't know if that hierarchical connections are working here, but it's interesting how we have to have these different scales. It could be that even if there's no hierarchical cconnections, maybe there's no new parent-child relationships being learned here. You still need these scales changes because you can learn very small things and large things, and the grid cells just can't adapt enough. Is there any questions
I wonder
about
if that could help as well with like some of the more extreme scale or child-parent relations. I'm just thinking like if you suddenly see like a mug the size of a house or something, um, or kind of blown up on a poster that's
yeah, what would you think?
I guess I'm just thinking you could associate location by location that object, even that if that's well, no, never mind.
I think if you saw, well, first of all, if I saw a mug the size of a house, I couldn't do flash inference. I mean, if I'm right in front of it. I mean, if I'm far away, sure, it doesn't make a difference.
Yeah.
But right in front of it, I don't think I could do flash inference. I can't get it all in my retina at once, right? So I have to look up and look down and look over. It's maybe like being at an intersection. And it might take you a little while because there's not many really interesting features on that mug. It'd be more like you'd have to it's like touching it with your finger. You have to be like tracing it out visually or something. I don't know. I'm not sure where you're going with that.
Yeah, sorry, it's dead end. I realized it.
Okay. Let's not pursue it. Okay, I'm going to see if I missed anything here. I haven't been reading my text. I think I've talked about most of the stuff. I did bring this question here about, is a single column sufficient to learn the number of models we needed to learn? And I even this morning, I was walking through numbers on this, and I think so. And I can give you how I got those numbers if you're interested. You can sort of walk through back of the napkin kind of calculation about how many things a single column can learn. But it can learn a lot. And so I'm going with that because our whole theory, the whole thousand brains theory is well, the first time I thought about the reference frames and the columns and voting all stuff, this is the very first thing that popped in my head. Wow, we're asking a single column to learn lots and lots of objects. Can it do that? And I just redid the math this morning or last night. I think it can. And if you're interested, I can go through it. So then I started thinking about these temporary arrangements here. And then Vivian, you wrote a note here, or no, that's just your cursor. Jose, you're confused about the second to last sentence down here? Or
Yes.
Down here. So one last option, if we have child object sufficient complexity, the morphology features don't matter. Well, I'll say edges don't matter. The orientations matter. So using the language we just talked about earlier, orientation matters, but like you don't need to look at edges of everything. Right?
Yeah, like
Yeah,
kind
that part I like.
morphology from direct sensory input, which hippocampus might not even get anyways.
I don't think so. One of the interesting things about this is that you no longer need to get sensory input here. You still have to have movement input into the columns. You still need to know how the sensor is moving, or in the case of the hippocampus, how the body is moving. But you don't have to get input from the sensor, because it really all you care about is the child objects and their orientation, and that's it, right? So you have to, down here, someone has to say, oh, that's a car, that's some orientation, but when it comes up to here, I just get the child object. I just say, oh, there's a car, it's some orientation. And you don't need to look at the retina for that.
And that movement would probably come from somewhere else. It wouldn't really be direct sensory input. It would
probably not.
It'd probably be like process movement and
right. And I don't. It's a good question. Because like if you think about the typical idea here is that it's the grid cells representing in your hippocampus or the entorhinal cortex. They're representing your body's location within the room, and the movements are not like the movements of your body, right? It's not like the eye or your arms, or it's already been processed somehow, right? So your body is moving forward at some velocity, but actually, your arms and legs and heads moving different directions. So I don't know how that's done, right? Presumably. But one of the nice things about it, I've been bothered by, okay, does the retina have to project to every single region, all the way up? And the answer is no, it doesn't. And so when we start thinking about, conceptual objects, we're not tied to the sensory organs anymore. We're just learning arrangements of child objects, and to the extent that those child objects can be somehow conceptual themselves, and we're learning concepts of concepts, things like that. But it might always come back to like some image in your head, like you might have to still be sort of arranging concepts of democracy, on a chart or a map or something like that. Anyway.
This answered my question, but
we did. I answered your question.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Well, should I not read it?
I mean, okay. So the second to last sentence, starts with, at this point in the cortical hierarchy, I don't see a need for a sensory input to drive which many columns in L4 should be active, which is what you said.
Right.
And then, I think. So I think I was confused about what you meant by sensory input, as in like directly from the retina.
I meant directly from the retina. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Then
obviously,
I think
ultimately it's going to be, it's the example of watching someone play a video game, first person, video game. You can know how the bodies of that player is moving by the visual input, but it's got to be processed, because the first thing that the retina is going to determine is how the retina is moving to the visual input. You're moving your eyes left and right and so on, but that's not what we want. We want to now get it to where's the body, which is not the same as how the sensor is moving. So there's got to be some levels of processing going on there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And as I said, it's not clear to me. A lot of the stuff is confusing to me still. This one here, gosh, I should have read this before we came here. This is the one I was talking about. Here, can it recognize a significantly large number? So I've already talked about that, unless someone wants to go into it. You could tell I'm sitting in the coffee shop looking out the window at this intersection all morning long. Imagine what I'm doing. This is just more of the same. I'm just basically pointing out that you just need one or two objects, child objects in your peripheral, in your view, if they're sufficiently complex, and then you know exactly where you are. And so that's the whole nature of inference has changed from like V1, where you have to sense all these little edges everywhere, to now, nope, just one or two things is good enough. And this is also has implications. If I thought about like, how do I recognize this intersection? There, imagine this intersection I'm looking at, and it's got dozens of things that are permanent there. Like there's signs and crosswalks and all this stuff, but I don't really memorize them. I only memorize the few big things. Like, oh, there's a unique sign for this plaza where I'm sitting, and there's this unique church across the street. And so, if I came in that intersection tomorrow and someone moved some of the signage or where the utility box was, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know, hey, that utility box, unless I interact with that utility box all the time. But it's part of the intersection. I see it all the time, but I don't remember that. I just remember the big things, and then and the little things, they can change. I wouldn't notice it. So this sort of, give me a sense for how we deal with this. And so I don't really, even though there's a lot of features in that intersection that are permanent and locked there, and I could learn where they are if I interacted with them. But most of them I don't. For example, there's a button I press to cross the walk, use the crosswalk with my bike. That button, I know exactly where it is and relative to the intersection. I touch it every day. But the ones on the other sides of the intersection, I never touch them, and so I don't know where they are. If they moved a little bit, I wouldn't know. I see them, but I don't remember them. Okay, thank you. That's a good guess. Doesn't mean we don't have to worry how we learn behaviors quickly. It's a good question, Hoji. I didn't even think about behaviors yet. I wasn't ready for that here. I want to get there next.
Okay. Yeah, I figure. I mean, it's referring to the, again, second to last sentence. When we think about how the brain solves complex behavior problems, we should assume the brain is using the temporary models in HCC.
Well, that's
and if we're kind of starting with HCC, then we have access to basically the whole scene or whole region instead of just straw vision. So I feel that would help.
I think so. If I'm reading your question right, or your suggestion right, I've kind of started to think that all my focus now is moving on to the hippocampal complex. It's like the entire cortex, all this stuff is just there to feed in high-level objects to the hippocampal complex, and some of those high-level objects are probable behaviors, and we hadn't talked about those at all. But the initial action of interest is happening in the hippocampal complex. By the way, I should point out, another thing I haven't really resolved yet is like, when we learn something quickly in the hippocampal complex, how does it get learned again more permanently in the cortex? And we've talked about this before. So if I experience it over and over again at the top of the hierarchy, what are the signals that are being sent down the hierarchy how is a parent-child relationship learned permanently in cortex?
And are there signals, I guess?
Well, there has to be something. Well,
but I feel like the older proposal that you had in the Thousand Brains theory was that they happen in parallel, and I always liked that but there is no transfer or kind of propagation.
Right, there is no transfer. There is no transfer. But how in parallel? I still believe that. The question is, what if I've not got this image in my head of, I'm learning this temporary arrangement of objects at the dining table, the temporary arrangement of objects at the intersection. What is actually going on in the cortex that it experiences that same arrangement?
I guess, I'm sure there's details to figure out, but in my head it was just also heavy in plasticity. It's just at a much slower rate.
Right. And
so you're going to have to look at that table hundreds of times, or similar tables hundreds of times, and then slowly a model will emerge.
Right. Although it may be trivial, Niels, but I'm still struggling. Like, okay, I've now got the hippocampal complex looking at the arrangement of the table, or maybe even, I think the hippocampal complex will even looking at the mug when you first see the mug with the logo. It's going to be up there, as I've argued before. What's going on in the rest of the cortex? Is it also experiencing at that point? I guess I just want to know how it is at that same point that the that, V1 and V4 or whatever are also experiencing the same two objects, the bug and the logo. It might be trivial. It's not obvious. It's like,
Yeah, I guess the hippocampal complex could help the lower regions to know which reference frame to store the informations in if it hasn't really learned a good model down there yet.
yeah,
So
I don't
basically,
know.
Hippocampus has learned a quick model of that table today, and now we see it again. So Hippocampus is able to recognize it again when it's not yet stored in V1 yet, but it couldn't, or whatever lower region, but it can tell the lower region to reactivate that new reference frame.
Maybe.
What
I
about
would,
attention?
yeah, that's the one I was going to say.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, good. I think it probably has to do with attention in play. Like, we're attending to this area in space, and everybody has to do that.
I can't, Jeff, I can't, okay, maybe it's
I have
just
to
me.
attend. I have to attend to the mug, and I have to attend to the logo. And so I don't know how V4 and V2 know to do that. It's like, it may be trivial. It feels like it's not really concrete for me. I agree with everything you said, Neil. It's going to be slow memory, repetition. I'm just asking, and it's not being transferred, but it's somehow, I have to make sure that those regions are experiencing the same thing. And I don't want to spend time. I think it'll become quick and obvious. I think it has to do with attention, the tangent area somehow like that. And Jose's point, I haven't even brought back behavioral models into this at all. But I think it's interesting your suggestion, Jose, that if we first learn behavioral models in the hippocampal complex, like I'm arguing we first learned morphology models or static models, that could help us resolve the learning issue of behavior models. Other than saying those words, I don't know how, but it sounds like a good idea. I see you had another comment down here about Monty. I have no idea how to answer that. That's for someone else.
Yeah, it's more of an open question, but I mean, since we're talking more about the hippocampus and, I'm not saying that we should implement it now, but if we were to implement it, are we thinking of hippocampal complex HCC as like a same as a learning module, or is it a little bit different?
I am, in my mind, I'm just thinking they're the same, except it can learn quickly.
Okay.
Yeah, I would.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, basically, right now, all of our learning modules learn as quickly as the hippocampal complex, but I guess the idea in the future would be that the lower ones would learn slower, so you have stabler representations, and then the hippocampal complex would get much more higher up in the hierarchy information as input. Like right now, the highest nesting is 2 levels, so there isn't really that big of a benefit. Like,
Okay.
yeah, you wouldn't get these quick models I've seen yet.
Right.
I think maybe the only other kind of difference that we've discussed that I think would apply in Monty as well is how time is represented, in that time in the cortex is a bit more this kind of rhythmic beating kind of stop clock type stuff, whereas time in the hippocampal complex is more kind of like a timeline where you hark back to a particular point and you have kind of this sense of events and when they occurred relative to one another and
Right. That's the
things like that.
episodic memory. Right?
The episodic memory, yeah.
Right. I mean, hippocampal complex has two things. It's got fast learning and has episodic. It's funny. It's a good point you bringing up, Niels, because I was thinking like, okay, maybe this episodic thing is an extra neural component that's added on top of the basic learning modules. And that's a nice idea because it means at the moment, what's something on my screen? It's like we can just treat the hippocampus, we could treat Monty as if they're all learning modules, and then later we can add a separate little mechanism for like, oh, when did this occur? Like a log. Monty could have the advantage of having like an infinite episodic memory. You know, what did you do on this date at 2 o'clock? Oh, I can tell you what I did on this date at 2 o'clock. You know, it's something that humans can't do. But I'm hoping that would be like a separate sort of mechanism somehow. It is a difference in hippocampal complex from everything else.
I have a question about the analogy between the learning modules, the neocortex and the hippocampus. We talk about in learning modules and neocortex, it's all about everything is an object's reference frame. And hippocampus, what reference frame is the stuff in? And is there a constraint where, like in the hippocampus, the reference frame has to be bigger than the body?
That's a good question. I don't think so. So first of all, an intersection is no different than a coffee cup. It's an object that's defined by a reference frame, and it doesn't have boundaries in the same way that a cup does. But again, we don't need that anymore. We're just looking at child objects, so we don't need to know where the boundaries of the intersection are. We just say, oh, you know, here's some child object. So I think it's the same. And it works exactly the same. And I think that the hippocampus can go from modeling rooms and buildings and intersections to modeling when the first time you learned a word, it's going to be learned in the hippocampus, and it's going to look at smaller reference frames. So I don't think there's anything different there. But then what was the second thing you said, Tristan, which is really interesting?
Is the hippocampus bound to represent reference frames that are larger than the body?
I would hope not. But there's another way of flipping around. Is the hippocampus the only place it can represent objects that are larger than the body? Can something like, I would argue that no, I think anything could do it. You know, it's funny, we were talking earlier about looking at a picture, you know, looking at a coffee cup that was the size of a house, right? You're standing right in front of it. Well, I think I don't know. I think as long as you can move your sensor to it and have an appropriate size reference frame, then I think there's no restriction. Anyway, the short answer to your question is I think the hippocampal complex can model small things and large things. That's why we have different scales of grid cells. And I don't think it's restricted to representing things that are larger than the body. But things that are larger than the body are not a problem. They're only a problem if you had to like vote by looking at all the features at once, and you can't see them all at once or sense them all at once. But we don't need to do that anymore.
The reason I'm thinking scale matters is because what movement is represented, right? Like if certain movement is me moving myself, my sensors, versus me moving my entire body. But what I'm hearing is that's kind of just similar thing anyway.
It is a similar thing, and somehow we don't know how how it is that your body knows how it's moving.
Yeah, it might be interesting. I seem to remember when we once looked in the scale of grid cells, and at least for kind of rodents, I think most of the grid cell modules, they're clearly kind of specialized for environments. So yeah, where kind of the animal's body is a point in the map and things like that. But people have also looked at, so if I share my screen, grid cells in primates in entorhinal cortex. And
I'll stop sharing. Is what you want me to do.
And this is in visual space. So they have a, I don't remember which exact animal it is, some sort of monkey that's looking at these images, and then they're looking at the cells, and the images are 11 by 11 degrees. So I don't know exactly, but maybe it's something like that. And then this is showing kind of grid cell activity in that space. So at least in this case, it's more fine-grained than like a mouse running around a field. So it's partly maybe that primates are much better at kind of learning objects. We may be better at learning objects at this kind of scale, which
you could also
probably wouldn't be too surprising.
You know, you can imagine rodents may not have ability to see complex objects that, you know, that are and manipulate them. I mean, we talked about they can pick up a piece of cheese and rotate it, or a piece of food and rotate it, but you know, obviously, clearly the system was evolved to navigate your body through space. I mean, that's the first thing you had to do. It doesn't do any good to know how to use a stapler if you don't, if you can't know where you are in the world. So,
Also, I mean, did they look for grid cells when the rodents were interacting with objects? Like, it seems like most experiments they are specifically looking for grid cells while the animals navigating environments. So it would be hard to find something that responds to the animal
right,
just like looking around or rotating something in its paws.
right. That's a good point. It could be. You're saying it should be easy to miss.
Yeah, they wouldn't
Remember
pick it up in those
remember the
experiments.
stories about how the O'Keeffes discovered grid cells, right? I mean, place cells. And then the Mosers discovered grid cells. And this, I'll repeat the story, you might remember it. And the O'Keeffe, when the Moses discovered grid cells and then they got a Nobel Prize for it, don't worry, the O'Keeffe got a Nobel Prize too. But he was really pissed because he says, I looked at those entorhinal cortex cells and I didn't see anything. And the problem was he was looking at ones that were too large a scale. So he just was looking at the wrong end of the entorhinal cortex. If he went to the other end, he would have found grid cells that were mapping clearly onto the environment of the animal. So that was an example where he missed it because he wasn't looking. He wasn't looking at the wrong scale. He was picking cells that with the wrong scale. And when you look at the cells with the wrong scale, that doesn't look like they're doing anything. So I was sort of related to your comment, Julian. That was a fun anecdote from history.
Yeah, I mean, all the cells that don't have a high enough grittiness score, like that's determined as far as I know on like looking at where the mouse is in their environment.
Right.
So if it's a grid cell that models a small space on the nut, then that wouldn't have a grittiness score.
Right. But I also wouldn't be surprised, given how small they only have really one visual region, V1, that they don't really build much. They don't really learn. They may have a just equivalent of V1 flash inferencing of morphology shapes of outlines of objects type of thing. They wouldn't. I'd be very surprised if they had any depth to their knowledge about. Oh yes, if I open this acorn, I'll find the seed, and I'll find this part, and I don't think they know that stuff. Anyway, I don't have anything else to present today. That was it. When I was doing this, it felt really, really exciting because I just felt like I got clarity on things. It was like, and then just finally understanding, like, okay, it's all happening in the hippocampus, and then the neocortex is all there just to support this. And so, as we start thinking about behaviors, which I'm going to work on right now, this week maybe. Then I'll be thinking.
Thanksgiving is the time of insights, isn't it?
Yes, you remember that.
No pressure.
I was wondering if I'd bring that up or not. Well, I felt this was I don't know how you guys feel, but I felt these things I just talked about today were big insights for me. Even though it introduced no new mechanisms, it just was like clarity. It's like, oh yeah, this makes sense, And I'm blown away.
I agree. I think it's all just kind of slowly being more concrete and becoming more concrete.
By the way, I didn't mention, of course, the entorhinal cortex has the medial and the lateral parts, which are people debated or to argue they're the same as the ventral and dorsal visual streams, the what and where pathways. So going back to Jose's comment earlier about behaviors, I didn't show it here, but there's presumably the I forget which is the medial entorhinal cortex. I think is the one that's the where pathway.